Hello, everyone, and welcome to CGT's exclusive supply chain report. I'm Alarise Rajagopal, Senior Editor of CGT, and today I've enlisted two subject matter experts from Mindtree to help me dissect some top-of-mind supply chain topics for the consumer goods industry, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to unfold, which, as we've seen, has catapulted every single supply chain right into the spotlight. In fact, in IDC's 2020 supply chain survey, 83% of companies responded that the coronavirus was already having or expected to have a major impact on their supply chains this year. Before we dive right into more questions, let's first have our panelists introduce themselves. So first, Anil, I'd like to start with you. Can you please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role at Mindtree?
Yes, thank you, Alarise. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anil Gandharve. I head up consumer goods business unit at Mindtree. We are a digital company, little over $1 billion, working across several Fortune 500 clients. Consumer goods has been one of the founding industries for us. So over last 20 years of our existence, we have worked with some of the most memorable brands. And I'm really happy to be part of this conversation today to share how the supply chain impact is being seen at several of our customers and what we see in the industry right now. So thank you and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Anil. Vin, can you also introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role at Mindtree?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Vin Palat, and I lead consulting at Mindtree for around the business and the domain for consumer goods. As Anil mentioned, consumer goods is one of those industries which is keystone at Mindtree, and we have some really brilliant Fortune 500 blue chip customers. We're constantly focused on how to enable and help our customers get forward in whatever they're doing. And this current situation has created opportunity as well as crisis. And we're really keen on being able to talk about what some of our customers are doing, as well as what we're seeing in the industry around this space and how everybody deals with the crisis. So thanks, Alarise.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So now that we know we have two very qualified leaders today, let's get into the first question. So there are many players present throughout the entire supply chain ecosystem. However, with the onset of COVID-19, better communication between these manufacturers, the brands, and the retailers along the chain has been an imperative for resiliency and responsiveness. So in conversations with your clients, how has COVID brought the need for resiliency into the open? And how are they working to implement more collaborative supply chains? So Anil, would you mind taking a stab at that question?
Sure. What we have seen, over the last decade or so, there has been a significant focus on the supply chain optimization, which has led to improved asset utilization, which has led to lower inventory cost. But at the same time, it has reduced all the buffer and flexibility supply chains used to have to deal with the experience which we are currently dealing with. So now what has happened with COVID, over the last couple of months, the fragility of the supply chain has been exposed like never before at all levels, whether it is about the tier one suppliers, secondary or tertiary suppliers, including the visibility risk between your extended supply network, lack of alternate logistic options, and so forth. But what we have seen is that there is a small minority of companies that have invested in advance in building up the supply chain, which can give them a transparent view across the end-to-end value chain there. Now, what we have seen is that these companies are well equipped to understand the structure of their supply chains. They are not scrambling at the last minute, but they are actually being able to look at the information on which supplier, which sites, what parts, which products are available, which are at risk, and in real time being able to reconfigure so that they can make their supply chain run as smoothly as possible. Now, the urgent need to design smarter, stronger, and more diverse supply chain has been one of the lessons of this crisis. What we have seen is that one of our consumer goods clients, one of the top 20 CPG companies, had invested way back in building a digital demand supply chain, or the demand part of the value chain, leading to uh, creating a visibility with the distributors, with the retailers, and with the end mom and pop stores. I'm actually talking about the experience which we have had in the emerging markets, where the situation on the general trade is very different, right? And you're not directly selling it to the consumers. You have multiple layers of your supply chain, which is actually making your products and brands available to the end consumers. Now, this company built a digital distribution management system, which allowed them to get a real-time visibility uh, at the market segments level. So at the distributors level, at the retailers level, as well as at the mom and pop stores. Now, what they have done very smartly is that they have been able to reallocate inventory in real time based on the channel performance. As the wave of COVID was going on from one part of the world to the another part of the world, this company was able to, in real time, reallocate inventory, reallocate the supplier side of the supply side of the flow, and address that with a very high degree of agility. Now, in the matter of weeks, the same company has also been able to repurpose number of manufacturing facilities to build essential products. Some of their products have actually come to existence in less than 20 days. Is never been heard of. So the companies which have invested earlier to build digital ecosystems to give them the visibility not only on the supply side of the equation, but also on the demand side of the equation, are coming out stronger than others. And I think it is going to be a big lesson for rest of the CPG companies on having a smarter and stronger supply chain means not only having a highly optimized supply chain, but also having a highly flexible and collaborative supply chain, which can give the information to the business users on the details they need to know and make the real-time decisions.
Great. Thanks, Anil. I know you touched on it a little bit, but according to our report this year, it comes as no surprise that overall supply chain visibility was the #1 focus when it comes to mitigating risk in the supply chain. So how can companies gain better visibility in their supply chains? And are there any of your clients that are doing this well?
Sure. I think the good news is that there are lots of new supply chain technologies which have emerged over the last few years. And these technologies are going to dramatically improve visibility across the end-to-end supply chain. Now, what we have seen is that the traditional linear supply chain models are being transformed into digital supply networks. What I mean by that is that the functional silos which used to exist in a classical linear supply chain are now being broken down, and the organizations are connected through the entire supply network to enable end-to-end visibility and collaboration. Some of the technologies which we are seeing in action as we speak, and I will talk about an example just in a few minutes. But the technologies like Internet of Things, building in artificial intelligence, bringing in robotics, leveraging the 5G technology to help design the digital supply networks is becoming the new norm. And organizations which are able to deploy these DNS are ready to deal with the unexpected. the organizations which are able to deploy the digital supply networks are ready to deal with the unexpected, like the one which we are currently dealing with. Now, the example which I was talking about earlier, that same company has been able to create their IoT twins of several factories. What it means is that they can run the manufacturing facilities without needing to have as much physical presence as it was required. Almost everything is digitized from the point the raw material comes into the factories to the point when it is loaded to the logistics provider. And this is going to become the norm. While many of the companies have been able to handle the disruption on the manufacturing side, but some of the companies which have actually invested early enough in the capabilities to run remote manufacturing facilities have had an uninterrupted supply chain, right? There is another example which I have seen is that one of the retailers had almost 80 to 90% of the inventory at the retail stores level. And when the COVID started to impact, the consumer demand pattern changed. Everyone started to go online and buy, started to leverage online channels. Now, what this retailer required was to reconfigure their supply chain to make stores as the last mile fulfillment centers. They did not have the technology which could have enabled them to do this. And on one hand, they ended up missing some of the sale that was coming in through the online channel. But on the other hand, they also ended up not effectively utilizing the retail stores, the real estates, the people who they had in the stores. So some of these lessons are going to become very important, which will impact the entire consumer goods and the retail industry on investing significantly on both supply side as well as the demand side in the entire value chain. Now, what has also happened is that this crisis has heightened the focus on data. Across the entire supply chain and ecosystem, now there are technologies which can help us build the transparency, can recommend some of the decisions which needs to be made in the real time with machine learning, with artificial intelligence, things like inventory planning, things like assortments, flexible replenishment, ability to react and plan with more flexibility are all going to be part of a new normal with these new technologies.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good segue to our next question. So if you wouldn't mind, Vin, I'll switch gears to you. With increasing e-commerce accelerating different methods like hyper-localized fulfillment, can you talk about some of the new business models you're seeing in conversations with your clients?
Yeah. So I'm gonna actually not call it e-commerce so much as much as digital channel expansion, because that's really what it is. It's not. It's one of the things that came about during this crisis quite clearly was the fact that you saw retail stores taking massive hits because of empty shelves, and that just drove people to panic buy and consistently just really destroyed either the retailers or the consumer goods companies' ability to continue to replenish. So what that did in terms of from a consumer goods standpoint, or any of these companies that were doing the manufacturing, is that at the end of the day, the biggest fallback or the biggest block or wall that they had to overcome was creating that transparency. And how do you create that transparency with the end user? So the way that we look at it is it's not just e-commerce, because it's not only your ability to actually transact and buy and sell, but it's also how do I create a digital channel expansion so that I'm creating things like what Anil was talking about in terms of digitization as well as flexibility, but transparency and communication. So how am I communicating to the ends of my supply chain that, hey guys, I actually have stock that will hit you? consumer goods companies, at least in the past 5-6 years, have either dabbled in or are definitely looking at direct to consumer as options. Now, is the same strategy applicable across the consumer goods industry? Probably not. But there are versions of actually being able to do consumer goods direct to an end consumer that have evolved and really heightened in this crisis. I mean, if you look at the fact that you have, and it's amazing that you see this within general trade as well as modern trade, but you actually look at the go-to boxes, where consumer goods companies are looking across the multiple lines of their manufacturing and supply chain to put an essentials box together and actually have that essentials box as its dynamic assortment and a product on its own or a bundle on its own, making its way down to the retailer and as well to the end consumer. So whether it be B2B marketplaces as channels, whether it be leveraging retailers to do e-commerce, or actually going into the fray of D2C themselves, consumer goods companies have thought about it. It's just how are they course correcting right now to be able to do this? And the successful ones are also looking at how do they partner. Some of the interesting partnerships that have come up along the way have been traditional, grocery-driven companies that have partnered with sports goods, which is really outside of their partnership, but they've brought it in because it basically means that you're addressing the need of the consumer, and you're seeing a lot of those alliances and stuff that would have taken a significantly long time to build, not just from a corporate legal perspective, but even from a supply chain. I mean, some of these distributors are spread all over the world. So to be able to cohesively bring that together and give that as one standard product to the end consumer is remarkable in terms of the technology that is involved and us helping our clients to enable stuff like that. Apart from that, in the digital, in all of the digital channel expansions, you've seen even traditional platforms like Instagram and Facebook. I mean, Facebook moved to e-commerce, Instagram commerce. You're looking at all of those platforms evolve and consumer goods companies actually getting into the fray there, whether it's from a perspective of creating the transparency into their supply chains, or it's a question of actually interacting with the end user and understanding what is it that I can give you. So the other part of it that I think is really interesting is, and you know, most people that are watching any of this during COVID-19 always hear the thing about being fit and health, and you know, there's diet apps and exercise apps that have been blooming across the board. What a lot of consumer goods companies are looking at, and you know, we're working with them to enable some of these things, is how do you, it's a really nice partnership. How do you bring in the, you know, whether it's health food or you bring in, you know, hygiene related equipment or any of that into that foray, because you know you have a group of consumers that is focused on what they are currently doing, which is using the app or you know, driving health and bodily fitness. So all of those things are really, really cool and interesting that have, as I mentioned, come up as opportunities during COVID-19. The thing that I think is most important in this space is that expectation of the end consumers, the transparency that consumer goods companies and the manufacturers through consumer goods companies, whether it's secondary, tertiary, you know, up the chain or down the value chain, creating that transparency and making that open, you cannot reverse it, because now everybody is getting used to that, and that has become their expectation. So even though we know, and I'm sure you've probably seen this as well, some companies, when they're not as further along in the process in investing in digital, as Anil mentioned, have kind of had to put band-aids. You know, have written technology on top of technology to be able to deal with what's happening right now. And the expectation was that once we get through this, we'll figure out a solution. You're not going to be able to do that. This is now an expectation that has been set. It's like, you know, allowing your teenage daughter a curfew of midnight. You can't suddenly flip that over and say, oh, well, now that we're done, you're back to 10. The expectation's been set. So now the thing is, how do I build, and this is where we work with our all of our clients, is that you set this expectation. One is that this is now the new expectation, but that expectation is just going to keep going up. So how do you churn whatever you've had to build in a hurry that were band-aids to make it scalable and reliable, and how do you consistently move it forward? That also goes back very clearly to what Anil was talking about data. So that's kind of the way that we're seeing this space on what we would rather call digital channel expansion growing.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think we're seeing that as well in our coverage. There is kind of this divide on people really taking a hard look at their supply chains and where they are and where they need to go. So I would absolutely agree with that. Can I just have you expand a little bit on the how? So you talked about consumers having different expectations and, especially with the current situation, but even going forward, how do we prepare that future supply chain for these different expectations, and how do you support that going forward?
So one of the key things and this is not just from a perspective, but this is also from conversations we're having with some of our clients, is transparency. So digitizing your ecosystem, and it's not just digitizing it down to your secondary supplier or your tertiary supplier, but actually creating some of that transparency down to their secondary and tertiary suppliers as well. So within the entire ecosystem, you're creating that transparency. You need to keep, and the reason that you've seen companies change their manufacturing is also because you need to keep that ecosystem going. You need to keep infusing it with energy. But how do you create that transparency? So things that were being discussed earlier as, dynamic planning in terms of demand planning of whether it was raw materials or whether it was actually what was coming in and building your constraints, will have to get a lot more transparent and a lot more digital. So that is one of the big spaces that we're looking at. Anil touched upon the newer technologies, whether it's IoT, AI, ML, all of those, and the critical, I think for me personally, and I'm sure Anil thinks the same, is one of the key things that we've realized is so tantamount in all of this is data. Consumer goods companies, retailers have been collecting seams and reams of data for so long, but how important it is right now to actually understand, synthesize, and be able to use it quicker is just getting more transparent. So I would say digital is digitizing your ecosystem, even doing it as small bites at a time. And even from a technology perspective, you don't really have to, it depends on your size as well as what you're trying out. You don't necessarily have to go down the route of a large platform. You can actually use digital ecosystems, and some of them spring up pretty quickly, whether it's building micro apps or micro transparent flows of information and leveraging workflows that exist, as well as building digital workflows along the ecosystem. So I think digital is key, and it's moving very, very quick in digital, because if you think you can play catch up, the likelihood is you're not going to. The second part of it to me is data and understanding data. And I know for a lot of consumer goods companies, sometimes this can seem overwhelming that I have, 2 data lakes and 5 different databases and 1 on-prem and all of that. Pick your small bite-sized chunks and go after them. The boiling the ocean is a brilliant strategy, but if you don't address here and now and pick those bite-sized chunks, you're still going to be struggling. Customer focus has been critical, and we've seen a lot of consumer goods companies in the past couple of years focusing on customer and consumer. It's also time to be able to leverage that information backwards. So actually leveraging the consumer 360 information that you collect, the CRM information that you collect, to help you with inventory planning, with dynamic assortments, with dynamic pricing, is going to be so tantamount in this space. The third is communication. I think the transparency from being able to communicate, and the minute that you start that, like any relationship, if you start being really communicative and then you suddenly go back into a box, somebody's going to question your intentions. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. Consumer goods companies, whether it was even on, from a news media perspective, were being so much more open and were discussing, because everybody was okay discussing the problems they were having since they were universal. Now, you've made that information available to the global ecosystem. You've made us all feel like now we can trust you because you're telling us what's happening. You can't switch over. So communication, so for me, it's digital, data, transparency of communication flow. And like Anil mentioned, all of that will drive redundancy and flexibility into your ecosystem.
So before we go, I just want to thank you both, Anil and Vin, for joining me today and for all the insights you've shared. And I'd especially like to thank Mindtree for sponsoring the 2020 Supply Chain Report. If you'd like to learn more about Mindtree or any other CGT exclusive reports, please visit consumergoods.com for more information. Thanks for watching.